Female athletes, we have, role models in the WNBA, first and foremost. Not just in the success they found as a league, but more so in their players. I mean, we can't forget that they were the first ones to stand up for Black Lives Matter back in 2016 before Colin Kaepernick took a knee. And, they were met with punitive measures. They were fined, and the teams are fined, and the individual players are fined. And, in response, they just said, we're not going to take your interviews unless we're talking about Black Lives Matter. That's a story that's often overshadowed by Kaepernick and his, kneeling in the NFL. But we need to look to those role models. And I think part of it is finding athletes, female athletes, that we, see ourselves in. If you want to be considered among the best in the world, then act like the best in the world.
This is Social Justice in Women's Hockey, a new series of critical conversations about the role of women's hockey in the fight against oppression. I am your host, Erica Lindsay Ayala. This week, I'm joined by retired goalie and current board member of the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, Liz Knox. Liz and I discuss allyship in the women's hockey space, mental health and holistic approaches to policy reform in wake of the killing of George Floyd and others, and what women's hockey can learn about being present in social justice movements from the WNBA. We hope you learned something from this conversation and that you are challenged to join the fight against all forms of oppression. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Social Justice in Women's Hockey. Erica Ayala here, your host. Few things I want to mention before we get into the episode. I recorded this episode with Liz Knox on Tuesday, June 9th. So first thing, go wish Liz Knox a happy belated birthday. Yes, we recorded on her birthday. That is commitment if I ever. Liz mentions a lot of amazing things in this episode, such as educating the women's hockey community, what allyship looks like and how allies can educate each other, or how the practice of allyship involves educating oneself as well as others. Question of the episode: what does passing mean, and how does it impact inclusion in hockey? Make sure you subscribe to Social Justice in Women's Hockey. We have a pair of Riveters captains coming up, as well as a very important man to the women's hockey landscape. Excited for the next few episodes. If you don't want to miss anything, though, make sure you subscribe to Social Justice in Women's Hockey. With that, let's head over to my interview with Liz Knox. Okay, I'm here with Liz Knox of the PWHPA on her birthday. Happy birthday, Liz.
Thank you.
For sure. So like I said, I wanted to just check in. It's been a while since you and I have had to have a formal, proper conversation. We touch base here and there. But let people know, how have you been dealing with coronavirus? And then now there's a lot of other things that have kind of made the news cycle that we'll get into. But, how are you during all of this?
Not bad. I think I'm one of the kind of unique situations. I'm actually busier than I ever was before quarantine. My day job is in commercial renovations, and we work a lot in the hospitals. So we've been doing a lot of renovations just in terms of if there were a second wave, or if we saw a surge in cases like we did in Italy, making sure that the hospitals are prepared, that their structures are prepared for that they can have enough patient beds and that sort of thing. And then I'm a volunteer firefighter on the side, so obviously making medical calls and stuff like that. But I'm very fortunate. I mean, I have work, so I'm very fortunate for that. I have a good family at home, and while I'm at work, I have lots of PPE, and I feel well protected by my employers. So there's certainly worse cases in the world, so I just kind of count my blessings.
Yeah, well, thank you for all that you're doing out there in Canada, and glad to hear that you are safe and well protected. And and again, that you're able to make sure as many other people are safe as we're still dealing with coronavirus pandemic. But it's here in New York, at least, we're starting to test the waters as far as, we're opening non-essential businesses and stuff. But, that's not even the most pressing conversation and the most pressing thing that's happening, which a few weeks ago I never really would have guessed. But at the same time, as someone who identifies as Black, it's been interesting to see something that I personally think of almost every week be a part of the conversation. So I want to start there. Unfortunately, we saw another example of police brutality here in the United States, which I think has sparked a lot of the protests and, riots and things that we've seen throughout the world, that of course being the killing of George Floyd. But there have also been cases that have happened, or names, unfortunately, like Brianna Turner, or even a case in Canada as well. So Liz, I know that's a lot, but again, amid a worldwide pandemic, once you started seeing the news, particularly of George Floyd, what were some of the first things that crossed your mind?
Yeah, I think, if you had have told us that 2020, had this pandemic in store for us, and then arguably that wouldn't be the biggest thing that we self-reflect on, or that we have to, kind of change and interrogate in our own lives. I think most people at the beginning of the pandemic would have, thought you were off your rocker, but yeah, certainly. I mean, it's terribly tragic what happened to George Floyd, what is happening to Black people, not just in the States, but as you said, in Canada as well. And Brianna Turner, another, very tragic example. And I think, kind of conjoining the two, and I've had a lot of time to sit and think about it. I just think we're in an interesting way, we're kind of in the perfect scenario to sit and think about our lives, think about our privilege, or, think about our lack of privilege, think about, what kind of mark we want to leave on history. And, our generation of thinkers and of, hopefully of actors as well, because it's great to think, but it's more important to act. We have the opportunity here to really kind of change the course of our history. And like any good change, it takes the right group of people to do it. As I said, it's unfortunate to see it as an opportunity, because so many lives and so many tragic events had to lead to it. But, the optimist in me says to find the silver lining, and, hopefully we find the stage to really make a difference moving forward.
I mean, and have you been having conversations about what has been happening with other people? What have those conversations been like? What are some of the questions or the challenges that have presented themselves as you try to navigate through what we're all seeing?
Yeah, I think, I was a sociology major in university. So fortunately or unfortunately, this isn't the first time that I've kind of looked at my own life. But I think I'm realizing that that's a school of thought that a lot of people haven't really had a taste of, and especially white people. So I think my first instinct was to reach out to my Black friends and, check in on them, make sure that they are okay. Obviously, people like Sarah Nurse come to mind, and somebody who not only has had to deal with the discrimination of being a Black woman in hockey her whole life, but now has this huge spotlight on her of, what do you think of this? And her friends coming to her being like, what do we do? How do I say the right thing? And, that's not a spotlight she's ever asked for. Granted, same as Saroya Tinker, Kelsey Colesler, Blake Bolden, these women are powerful and empowered, luckily, women who are using their voice, but it's not something they've ever asked for. So my first reaction was check in with my friends and, make sure that they're okay. Obviously, a very, very traumatic footage that came out of the George Floyd murder. And then, of course, my next thing is to talk to my white friends and, have those conversations that I've honestly never had with them, because, it's not, race is not something that we often talk about. especially in the hockey world, it's, separate politics and sports. That's what we kind of keep hearing. But I had a few tough conversations, honestly, of the same sort of thing. What kind of mark do you want to leave on history? And, part of those conversations were reaching out to people with big platforms that maybe in the past have made some comments or done some things that, I've met them in person, and I don't honestly believe that that's the kind of people that they are. And so I think the best thing I could do is just offer the conversation. You never know where it's going to go, but if you don't reach out, if you don't lend the olive branch, then the conversation stops there. And I think that on my shoulders is kind of part of my purpose, is to have tough conversations with people that maybe have never had to have them before.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, you being in the women's hockey space, there's so many really unique intersections there. On the one hand, a lot of times when I talk to women about all of the different isms that we experience in society, and then I ask what that looks like in the hockey space, in the women's hockey space, a lot of what I hear is that there's an awareness that things like racism or sexism exist in that space, or even homophobia and other things. But there's not always taking the initiative to have those difficult conversations, or even to stop, whether it's a joke or, some of the microaggressions. There's not always that next step. When it comes to kind of those different intersects in the women's sports space, where have you found the most difficulty in really trying to find some of that common ground, or just a foundation of understanding to even get to the next level of the conversation?
Yeah, I think as a feminist myself, and I identify as gay, so and I'm obviously a woman, so when you talk about isms, like, yeah, there are some things working against me in my favor in terms of, the white man's world. Mm-hmm. The benefit that I have is I have the choice to pass, right? So when we talk about women's hockey and where women's hockey fits in the world, by and large, we're trying to fit into a culture of hockey, which is predominantly, upper class white male. So when we're in a room full of hockey guys, like, yeah, I can pass in there, right? I can either perform heteronormative, or I can, jock talk, or however it is, and I can find a comforting space in there, even if I'm a bit of a chameleon. Mm-hmm. The difference is that, Black women, like Black people in general, people of color, Indigenous people, you don't have that choice. You don't have the choice to pass. So whether it's in the culture of hockey, or, if you're a Black woman in a room full of white men, or, going back to your isms, wherever you don't fit in, do you have the choice to not fit in? And, I think that's something that we don't often recognize as white women, because we see the NHL and we see the show. And in our lives, that's the dream. We just want to be treated as equals. We want to be put on that pedestal and play professional hockey, and that's all part of it. But, changing what that space looks like has to be part of our dream, because it needs to be more accepting. It's to everybody's benefit. And, I hope to create a space that people don't feel the need to pass as anything more than themselves, which is a lofty dream, in all honesty, but it has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, I think, that's really something that, again, is so difficult for people to even willingly bring to the table, because there is that, this otherness also. So you've got the isms, but then there's this kind of the structural and cultural otherness, where we're always trying to be, we're talking about the women's hockey space, like you said, always striving to be like the perfect model of professional hockey, which I think for a lot of people is the NHL. But in this case, the NHL, I'll put this on me, Liz, but is far from the ideal space where honestly I never thought I'd find myself in a hockey space talking about these things. So even like saying this out loud is kind of freaking me out. But like that's just not a space where I'm comfortable having this conversation, which is exactly why I think this series is so important. I'm very new to hockey culture, but I've been Black my whole life. But you know, I think, what is it about that hockey culture that even when we hear stories like Willie O'Ree, or Akeem Aliu and what he's been able to write in the last year or so, so many others, countless others. And then now going back to last week where Saroya Tinker shared her story, and last week on this show shared why she almost quit. She almost quit hockey before even, you know, finishing college. You know, when as a hockey player, as someone who's still in that hockey space, really fighting to make hockey more equitable, I mean, what about that? You know, what's your reaction to knowing that there's so many Black people in hockey in particular right now that are really struggling to even know if, even as everything is kind of, you know, blowing up on social media, if this long term will be a space that will be accepting of them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to unpack, obviously. As an athlete, you know, who doesn't love the underdog story? Like this is, you know, one of the pillars of sport, of how we consume sports is, you know, the St. Louis Blues. You go from being like a, you know, average at best hockey team to winning the Stanley Cup. We love that story. So again, the optimist in me says, you know, are we at the point in history? Can we make this that point for sport, for hockey specifically, right? We've seen it in other sports of athletes coming from, you know, third world countries and you know, becoming world champions, or your rags to riches stories. But we don't see enough people of color, enough Black people in the NHL to affiliate with that story. And so I think, you know, a lot of that is opportunity, and a lot of that is grassroots. And in hockey, it's not easy, right? I'm sure daily there's obstacles that you face that tell you why you should quit. And as women playing hockey, you know, that's you know, it's amplified. Every day you find a reason why you shouldn't continue to play hockey. I mean, every day I see a reason why I shouldn't continue to, you know, be on the board of the Players Association. But at the heart of it, you know, there's a good reason for it. So it's a lot to unpack. And but at the end of the day, it is, you know, it's visibility. And I think that you're right in, you know, saying that the NHL has room to grow. I think there's a lot of room to grow. And when you're trying to reach fan bases of all, you know, skin colors, ethnicities, religious backgrounds, you know, all walks of life at the end of the day, if you want to make hockey a global sport, one that everyone can relate to, then it has to look global.
Yeah. And you mentioned the PWHPA. Obviously, you are on that advisory, and even when the CWHL was around, that's when we first, you know, had our conversation. But you also were active in making the hockey space that you occupied better for women, and better for the future of women's hockey. So my question now for you, Liz, is specifically with the space that you occupy right now and the leadership that you have, you know, what would you like to see the PWHPA specifically be able to do as far as moving the needle forward, for not only your players, but for the future of the women's game?
I think that, you know, I think from the get-go, my role on the PA has always kind of been, you know, the voice of the non-national team player, the voice of the player that hasn't had the chance to really live the dream or couldn't. And I think as we interrogate racism in hockey more, I think that's becoming a lot more of my purpose as well. You know, my first kind of actionable item is Let's educate our players. Let's talk to our players about how to even talk about racism. I think a lot of players don't have the language and they're afraid to say the wrong thing. And if they do say the wrong thing, you know, it's like they just turtle and they just want to, you know, hide from it. And, you know, if you get negative feedback, you know, how do you become a good ally? And I think that's the first thing is just to educate players on how to be an ally, and then to you know, push it one step further and how to be an effective ally. You know, how can we create that space? And certainly in terms of race, but also, you know, one of my best friends was struck by a drunk driver when she was coaching a Division I school, and she's a quadriplegic now. And I keep telling her, I keep bugging her, like, man, like, let's get you back in the game. Like, you don't forget hockey. You know, if you grow up with it, if you grow up watching it, it's part of you. Let's use your voice. Like, you have no idea who you might inspire or touch just by doing a rinkside interview, you know? So I think it's just looking for me, it's looking for areas of opportunity of, you know, maybe it starts out as a small step, but you create a little bit of space, right? Let somebody occupy that space a little bit. Let's see what happens. And then when that happens, maybe we make the space a little bit bigger. And, you know, hopefully at the end of the day, you see a much more diverse, you know, voice behind the game.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I was on a different podcast and I mentioned that there's so many, what I know about hockey is that there are so many organizations that work in communities around literally the world that have these types of conversations every single day, because there are families that show up that are hockey loving families, and everything from thinking of our rinks accessible, and are we making sure that we're engaging communities that don't identify as able-bodied, or are we talking to Native communities or Indigenous communities? You know, there's so many great organizations that have been doing that, and I would love to see the hockey community really turn to those organizations and learn from them. Because elite level hockey, as you mentioned earlier, has this look to it, but that's not what hockey across the world looks like, not even close.
Yeah, and I think that you know, it's not just about, like, everybody can't make the NHL, right? As women, we cannot make the NHL. You know, if you come from, you know, humble beginnings and your parents can afford to put you in hockey for your whole life, you most likely will not make the NHL. But I think the idea of hockey culture is creating fans. And, you know, whether you're a fan of the game or you're a fan of a team because of how they act, you know, in their communities, or you're a fan of an individual player, I think that's what any sport is about, you know, bringing people together and believing in something. And I think the more, as you're saying, like, the more we can make that look like everybody else, you know, not just, you know, rich white men, you know, it's tough to say, honestly. I feel you. Like, it's not easy to call them out, but it's true. Like, I grew up, you know, humble beginnings, and my parents, you know, remortgaged their house to get me in hockey pads when I was young. And those are things that I don't forget, because now when I have an opportunity to have a voice to change the game, maybe for somebody who is like in my shoes, yeah, you take that opportunity. Let's open the doors a little bit here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned my conversation with Saroya, and again, the thing that struck me so hard from that conversation, because I literally learned it as we spoke, was that she was mentally exhausted by what she experienced at her university, because of being a Black hockey player, that she was ready to give up on the game.
So for those who don't know, I actually was planning on retiring after my Yale career, just because I was sick of the game, and I was tired of the stuff I had been put through. But I think that my senior year coach that came in, that started coaching my senior year, he really helped me love the game again. So that's when I started talking to the NWHL teams. So for me, it wasn't the stress and the 40 hours a week and the balancing of time and school and hockey and whatnot. I think for me, it really was the white space I was in each day. So I think that's what became just, it was so tiring. And I think that's what made me fall out of love with the game. Because I think anybody who knows me knows I'm a total hardo. Like, anybody wants to work out, like, let's go do it. Like, I'm always down. I'm always ready to work hard and improve on whatever I need to. So I think that that's probably the main part of the game that was just so tiring, and I just wanted it to end. But I think that through all this, I realized that it is my job to be there as a voice for other women of color who are coming up in the game and in sport in general. So I think that's why I decided to play and continue my career.
The thing that I think is so interesting about that story is that that last piece doesn't happen if that coach didn't first show up and see his player. We've seen the hockey community we've seen the sports community take on mental health and mental well-being a little bit more, but I want to use that and Saroya's story as a little bit of a pivot to get your take on, the hockey space or being an athlete and balancing that competitive edge and having to really push your body and your mind to a place where you're always competing against yourself and your opposition, while also then being like someone who is whole and is well and is mentally, physically, and emotionally well. It seems that at times that those two things might clash. What has been your experience with that balance in a sporting space?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly did not have the burden, as you say, that Saroya would have had going to an Ivy League school and being the only Black player on a team. But as female athletes, I mean, I think we certainly understand what it's like to, a non-national team player, for instance, playing in these professional leagues. And, I put in my 10 or 12 hour day and I come home and I try to eat something. And then you go to practice and, I'm competing against one of the top, arguably top 5 goalies in the world. And I'm trying to earn my ice time, and then I go home and maybe I get 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and then you wake up the next day and do it all over again. And then imagine that life, combined with, your academics, which obviously carries a ton of pressure. And then, as you say, like being a representation of somebody that doesn't, fit in hockey. I think one of the first conversations I had is I reached out to Nursey and I said, hey, like, this comes from a good place, but I want to check on everybody. I want to make sure they're okay. Like, can I do that without making them feel more marginalized in a time that's already telling them, like, now is your time to speak up. Hey, all Black people, like, let's hear your opinion now. And so, she was awesome. She was very candid with me, saying, it's not for everybody. You can't just, can't push activism on everybody. And that's not just for, Black women in hockey, but that's for everybody. You can't push that activism. It has to come from the right place. And I mean, I think it's too much, right? Like, I mean, I messaged you, my first thing is like, how are you other than tired? Because I get it. Like, it's exhausting. And on top of trying to make, progress on years and decades of work that you've already put in, you're also having to go back to step one and help people along those little baby steps as well. So, I think there's been a lot of a positive conversation around educate yourself first. Don't come in blind and just ask questions like, hey, is racism in hockey? Well, like, let's do a little Google search first before we, let's do a little history. Let's brush up on some of our, feminist history and, Black rights movements. And let's just get a little bit of a feel for it before we start asking, especially our Black friends, what do I say or what's happening? Because it's a lot. It's exhausting. I don't I don't envy it. I don't envy the position that, those players are in.
Yeah. I really appreciate you bringing up different movements and, Black women. And I know even a lot of people have been bringing up Black trans women, especially, we're in Pride Month. And the one thing that I just want to offer for anyone watching is that, to your point, Knox, yes, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. And that right now is more saturated than usual. However, there's this lingering feeling of tiredness, as Saroya put it, when you're in a white space. So, and maybe this is just me speaking, like, yes, I'm tired, but I'm always tired. Like, I'm always tired. It's just kind of, the way that I would imagine that women in sports feel. It's like, yeah, when someone says something really off base and sexist, or women aren't on an alliance for hockey diversity, yes, of course we're tired, but like, we're always tired. And it's just a matter of finding ways to not just zero in on those populations that 1 month of the year that we celebrate them, or when something really bad happens, but finding, as you said, ways to check in. So I really appreciate you offering that. I want to switch gears a little and talking about mental health and wellness. The story that I've seen coming out of Ontario and Toronto is of Regis Kerchinsky-Paquette, and her story, when I first started hearing it, it came in a lot of very difficult pieces to understand and comprehend. But it seems now that she was a young woman who her family had called the police to intervene. She was having an episode. She had been dealing with mental health challenges for about 5 years prior to her death. And, it just calls into question policing. And we've seen in the States, at least, a lot of conversation about defunding police or thinking differently about how we utilize officers. I'm curious, as someone who's in Canada and in Ontario, what have you seen those conversations be around, one, Regis and the circumstances surrounding her death, but then also what that means long term as far as policy? I think the Toronto chief just resigned. I mean, like, what does that look like as far as you can tell right now, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot, right? I think the Regis scenario, with George Floyd's murder, it's all right there. Like, you can see it. With Regis's situation, it's a little bit more murky because we don't really know what happened. The family's saying one thing, and the police, of course, are saying another thing. And, part and parcel of that is the fact that she's a woman. So it's, do we trust her? Was she hysterical, or, was she just acting out? And that's a narrative that, is decades long. So it's a lot, honestly. And I think that when you talk about policy, I mean, the humanist in me is, what resources was she offered before it got to this point? And I think that's the whole, idea behind defund the police is why are we catching these scenarios, these instances, these criminals even at this point? What are we doing as a society to push them to this point? And that's irregardless of gender or race. What are we doing in schools? Why do we have more police officers in schools than we do therapists or guidance counselors or mental health specialists or nurses even? And in Canada it's a little bit different because we do have universal health care, and in Ontario we have the Ontario Health Insurance Plan. So the idea is that, well, if you need help, you just go get it, because that's part of what we're offering. But having that as a resource and having the conversations around mental health or seeking help in general are very different. And I think that's, not due to lack of effort as of recent, but due to a long history of people and, society around the idea that, being mentally ill is something to be ashamed of, or a weakness, or an illness even. And I think we're trying, but again, when you look at the numbers, when you have more police officers in schools than you do, people advocating for these kids' health. And I say kids because I believe that, in your early formation, I mean, you're forming young human beings. You're teaching them, what kind of world they're going to grow up in. And if these kids are struggling with depression or anxiety or any sort of mental health issues, and you're telling them that there's nobody for them to talk to at school, then they're going to go off to college or maybe into workplace, or, wherever they end up, and still feel like there's nobody to go to. So why all of a sudden, when you're 22 or 23, you're out of the school system, why all of a sudden are you going to go seek help? I mean, you've never been offered it before in your life. So I think, we have a lot of room to grow, but it's, I mean, it's resources offered versus it's prevention versus, I'm a firefighter, so it's prevention versus suppression, right? The easiest way to prevent a fire is don't let the fire happen. Save lives by don't letting fires happen. And, right now I feel like our criminal justice system is much more suppression. Like, let's put the fires out once they've started versus, hey, let's do some things to prevent the fires from happening.
Yeah, I love that. As someone who comes from child advocacy before getting into the wide world of sports, that's definitely what we try to teach as well. Is if you create, this entire ecosystem and you wrap children around all of the things that they need growing up, even if that isn't, for whatever reason, able to come from their direct family unit, then the chances are that they will grow, or at least learn how to meet their needs and seek the help and the support to do so. Which also leads me to wrapping this up, thinking about women's hockey. I have heard from hockey players that, sometimes bringing attention to, if it's blatant racism or maybe just something that they just didn't appreciate it and felt was unnecessary in the hockey space. I mean, some of that is that you just go so long with it being acceptable that you too go along with that. I know that you mentioned some of the things that the PWHPA are doing, but are there resources that you would like the entire hockey community, especially for girls and women's hockey, to tap into a little bit earlier in that pipeline, to be able to, as you said, be preventative for some of these things? Like, who are the people that we should be talking to make sure that again, we're wrapping ourselves around girls and women, but particularly those hockey players of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think as female athletes, we have, role models in the WNBA, first and foremost, not just in the success they found as a league, but more so in their players. I mean, we can't forget that they were the first ones to stand up for Black Lives Matter back in 2016 before Colin Kaepernick took a knee. And, they were met with punitive measures. They were fined, and the teams are fined, and the individual players are fined. And, in response, they just said, we're not going to take your interviews unless we're talking about Black Lives Matter. That's a story that's often overshadowed by Kaepernick and his, kneeling in the NFL. But we need to look to those role models. And I think part of it is finding athletes, female athletes, that we, see ourselves in. If you want to be considered among the best in the world, then act like the best in the world. Certainly there's great resources. The way I see it is, when I look through my Twitter feed right now, like, I love it. I love that, I don't have many of those people that are, against the protests or even angry that they've turned violent. I think the voices that your circle of trust and the voices that you're going to listen to depicts, how you see things and the voices that you hear. no, that's not to say, don't branch out and don't see the other side. And, that's all part of critical thinking. But, Black girl hockey, certainly our Black, female hockey players in the PWHPA, but, and also in the NWHL, look for the voices that, in my opinion, have been silenced for so long, and see what they're saying. There are resources out there, and, I mean, it's funny because to me, it's like everything on my newsfeed is just, here's an article, here's a video, watch this Netflix series. So, I mean, there's no shortage, but I think that the intimidating thing for a lot of people is where to start, right? And so I think that's where I see my role with the PA is just having those awkward first conversations. Can I say the word Black people? Like, how should I refer to people of color? Or who does people of color, who does that encompass? Can I talk about this? Just asking some of those, you may think they're dumb questions, but for a lot of people, it's in the language of them finding how they're going to perform their allyship and, build outwards from there.
Yeah, I love that. And of course, we can't forget that although we're talking about race and racism, and very specifically through the lens of the Black experience, that there's so many other, as we said, isms or ways of otherness that society creates that we can also, and hopefully will also, have a similar conversation about, and not just because someone was killed or, someone had needs that were unmet or experienced, unfortunately, trauma in the hockey space. But Liz, I know it's your birthday, so it's still a time that we need to make sure that that we're taking care of ourselves. So I appreciate you joining us on the show, but I want to get you to your, to enjoy the rest of your night and enjoy your birthday.
Oh, honestly, thank you. And, thank you for your patience. There's a lot of, I feel, catching up to do. But I do believe that the work is being put in, and, I mean, I'm so thankful that, we have the support of you and your journalism, to really give us the exposure to race in hockey that we've lacked for so many years. It's not something that comes lightly, and I'm sure it's not a burden that, you carry lightly, but, we really do appreciate you. And, I support everything that you're doing to keep the conversation moving forward.